The wind was a living thing out here, a constant, keening presence that scraped against the clapboard walls and found every crack in the glass. It carried the scent of dry earth and distant pine, but mostly it smelled of emptiness. Alara stood in the center of the main room, dust motes dancing in the single shaft of weak afternoon light that pierced the gloom. The silence beneath the wind's howl was the loudest sound she had ever known. It was the silence left by betrayal, by the abrupt absence of footsteps and careless laughter, by the shattering of a life she had believed was built on solid ground. Just 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the wagon had pulled away, taking him and everything of value that wasn't nailed down, leaving her with a few worn blankets, a sack of flour crawling with weevils, and the stark, unforgiving reality of the land itself. He hadn't even left a note, just gone, vanished like smoke on the wind, taking with him not just her meager possessions, but her fragile hold on dignity and hope. Shame was a physical weight in her chest, heavy and suffocating. How could she have been so blind, so foolish? The questions echoed the accusations she imagined in the eyes of anyone who knew, anyone who might pass this way. But no one passed this way. This isolated patch of scrub and rock was too far from the nearest town, too marginal for anyone but fools or dreamers. She had been both. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Winter was coming. The air already had that sharp, biting edge, promising frost by nightfall. The small, inadequate pile of firewood he'd left would last perhaps a week, less if the temperatures truly plummeted. The nearest neighbor was miles away, a man they said was as wild and untamed as the land he clung to, a recluse named Finn who kept to himself and discouraged visitors. A man she knew nothing about, save for whispered tales of a dark past and a preference for solitude. Relying on him felt like throwing herself to the wolves, but the alternative was simply waiting for the cold to claim her. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every creak of the house a potential intruder. Her hands trembled as she tried to light the reluctant fire, the match flaring briefly before dying. She sank onto the rough-hewn floor, pulling the threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tears, hot and useless, tracked paths through the dust on her cheeks. She was utterly alone, stranded on a failing ranch with no resources, no protection, and a heart that felt like a bruised, hollow space inside her. The wind howled louder, mocking her despair, reminding her of the vast, indifferent world she had been abandoned in. Survival felt like an impossible dream, a cruel joke played by fate. She closed her eyes, wishing, for a desperate moment, that she could simply fade away, become one with the dust and the wind. The memory of his retreating figure, the back she had trusted, was a fresh wound, bleeding sorrow into the desolate landscape of her mind. This wasn't just hardship. It was the brutal consequence of misplaced love and naive faith. She was a woman alone, adrift in a world that had no mercy for vulnerability. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and gnawing fear. Alara rationed the flour, making thin, watery gruel that did little to quell the ache in her stomach. Each morning was a triumph, a tiny victory against the creeping despair, but it was a victory that felt increasingly hollow. She tried small tasks, gathering meager twigs for the fire, checking the dry, barren garden patch, but her strength was failing. The sheer scale of her predicament overwhelmed her. How could one person face down the elements, the endless work, the looming threat of destitution? She was a town woman, ill-suited for this brutal life, even with help. Alone, she was nothing. Then, she saw him. Not a clear sighting at first, just a movement on the ridge, a dark shape against the pale sky. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Was it him, returned, or someone worse? She watched, hidden behind the inadequate curtains, as the shape resolved into a man, tall and lean, moving with a quiet competence across the rough terrain. It was Finn. He didn't approach the house. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the small property, his gaze sweeping the fences, the derelict outbuildings. He carried a rifle easily, not pointed, but present. He spent a long time mending a section of fence the wind had torn down near the creek bed, working with a steady, deliberate rhythm. He didn't look towards the house, didn't acknowledge her presence, hidden or otherwise. He returned the next day, and the next. Always the same quiet work, a focus on the land itself. Repairing a loose shutter, reinforcing the roof of the small shed. He never spoke, never knocked, never demanded anything. His presence was unnerving, a silent judgment perhaps, or simply the dispassionate efficiency of someone accustomed to survival. Alara remained inside, observing him. Her initial fear began to mix with a grudging curiosity. He wasn't threatening her. He was fixing things. Not her, but the physical structures around her. It was a practical, wordless form of communication she didn't understand. Hesitantly, she began to leave small offerings. A tin cup of weak coffee on the porch step when he was working nearby. A piece of stale bread left on a fence post. He never acknowledged them directly. The cup would be empty the next time she looked, the bread gone. It was a silent exchange, a tentative reaching out met by a quiet acceptance that asked for nothing in return. One particularly cold afternoon, she watched him walk directly towards the house. Her breath hitched. He didn't stop at the door. Instead, he walked to the side, where the small pile of firewood lay dwindling. He disappeared behind the shed for a few minutes, and when he reappeared, he was carrying an armload of logs, thick and dry, clearly felled and split recently. He added them to her pile, arranging them neatly. Then, without a glance towards the house, he turned and walked away, melting back into the landscape as silently as he had arrived. It was a gesture so practical, so devoid of expectation, that it pierced through her defenses in a way no words of pity or comfort could have. It wasn't charity. It was an act of shared understanding in a harsh world. He saw her need, and he met it, not with sympathy, but with the quiet action required for survival. It was the first flicker of something other than despair she had felt in weeks. A tiny spark of bewildered gratitude. The quiet presence of Finn on the periphery of her life began to chip away at the solid block of fear and despair that had encased Alara. His actions were consistent, predictable in their practical, unasked-for support. He fixed a broken hinge on the cellar door, ensuring her meager supplies were safe from animals. He dug a small trench around the well house to divert rainwater. He didn't speak, and she didn't press him for conversation. Their interactions remained silent exchanges of small offerings and essential repairs. She would leave out water or a small portion of her food. He would leave a rabbit he'd snared or a bundle of medicinal herbs he'd gathered. This unspoken language built a bridge between them, fragile but real. Fueled by a slow-burning ember of resilience, Alara started to push back against her circumstances. She forced herself to learn. She watched how Finn banked the fire, how he sharpened his tools. She tried mending her own clothes with clumsy stitches, tending the few scraggly chickens that remained, learning to identify which wild plants were edible and which were not. It was agonizingly difficult work, demanding a physical and mental fortitude she hadn't known she possessed. There were days she still wept, days when the weight of her solitude and the memory of betrayal threatened to crush her entirely. But then she would see Finn's silent figure working on the fence line, or notice the neatly stacked wood by her door, and something inside her would stiffen. He wasn't giving her handouts. He was reinforcing the structure she needed to save herself. He was a silent testament to perseverance. One afternoon, a wagon rattled up the track, kicking up dust. Alara's blood ran cold. It was her husband's cousin, a man named Thomas she vaguely remembered, sharp-faced, with eyes that seemed to constantly assess value. He climbed down, looking around the property with an air of unpleasant entitlement. "Well, Alara," he said, his voice oily and condescending. "Heard about Robert. Shame. Heard he just left. Sad business." He didn't sound sad. "Figured I'd come check on things. A woman alone out here. It's just not practical. Dangerous." He gestured vaguely. "Property like this falling to ruin. Shame to see it wasted. I could take it off your hands. For a fair price, of course. Nominal, really, considering the state." His eyes raked over her, thin and worn, then over the neglected ranch. He saw only weakness and opportunity. He represented the judgment, the predatory opportunism she had feared. He made her past trauma feel fresh and raw. Alara felt her stomach clench, the old fear and shame threatening to overwhelm her. She mumbled something indistinct. Thomas stepped closer, pressing his advantage. "You can't survive here, girl. Be sensible. Let me help you. Sign it over. I'll give you enough for a train ticket back east." Maybe he reached towards her, a hand outstretched like a spider. Just as she recoiled, a figure emerged from the side of the house, moving with the quiet swiftness of a predator.
Finn.
He didn't speak. He simply walked to stand beside Alara, his presence a sudden, formidable barrier. He wasn't large, but he held himself with a stillness that radiated coiled strength. His eyes, usually remote, were fixed on Thomas, unblinking and hard. He didn't reach for the rifle slung across his back, but its presence was felt. Thomas stopped, his hand dropping. He hadn't expected this. Thomas's smug confidence wavered under Finn's silent, unyielding stare. He cleared his throat, looking from Finn's impassive face to Alara, whose posture had subtly changed from shrinking fear to a tense, uncertain defiance. "Who's this?" Thomas demanded, his voice losing its oily edge and taking on a sharper, suspicious tone. Finn didn't answer. He didn't need to. His presence spoke volumes. He wasn't just standing there. He was claiming his place beside her, signaling a quiet, formidable alliance. It wasn't just about protecting her from Thomas's immediate greed. It was about acknowledging her right to stand her ground and indicating that she was not, in fact, alone. Seeing that his easy mark was defended, Thomas's face twisted into a sneer. "Fine. Stay then." He spat, his eyes full of venom. "See how long you last. This land breaks everyone eventually, especially women who think they can play at being ranchers, and men who interfere in other people's business." He shot Finn a look of pure malice. Finn met it with unwavering calm. Frustrated and defeated, Thomas climbed back into his wagon and drove off, the sound of the wheels receding quickly into the vast silence. Alara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak, but her core felt different, stronger. She looked at Finn, truly looked at him, seeing not a dangerous recluse, but a quiet, capable man who had offered protection without a word, without asking why or expecting thanks. "Why?" she began, her voice hoarse. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, rarely used. "Land needs tending," he said, his gaze sweeping over the property Thomas had dismissed as ruined. "Can't tend it broken." He wasn't just talking about the fences or the roof. He was talking about her. It was the most direct he had ever been, a blunt acknowledgement of her state and the unspoken process of repair they had been engaged in. In that moment, something fundamental shifted within Alara. The shame and pain of her husband's betrayal hadn't vanished, but they no longer defined her entirely. She saw the truth. Robert hadn't just abandoned her, he had freed her from a life built on a lie, from dependence on someone who could simply walk away. The emptiness he left wasn't just loss. It was space. Space for the wind to blow through, space for her to stand up, space for a different kind of connection to take root. She was still vulnerable, the challenges ahead immense. But she wasn't the same woman who had crumpled in despair weeks ago. The harsh land hadn't broken her. It had, with Finn's quiet help, begun to forge her into something resilient, something capable of withstanding the wind, the cold, and the cruelty of others. True family, she realized, wasn't always bound by blood or law, or built on romantic promises. Sometimes, it was forged in shared silence, in practical kindness, in the simple, profound act of standing side by side when the world tried to break you. It was the quiet understanding that some things, like land and broken spirits, needed tending, and that some people, like her and Finn, were strong enough, together in their solitude, to do the mending. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fierce orange and purple. The wind still howled, but it sounded less like a lament and more like a challenge. And for the first time, Alara felt ready to face it.